Of the seven Jewish festivals that are highlighted in the book of Leviticus, chapter 23, the big three that featured a physical pilgrimage to Jerusalem were Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. You and I know them probably as Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. The Jewish feast of Shavuot, or weeks, is the backdrop of today's New Testament story. It's the context in which this story occurs. Now, Shavuot, or the Greek word that we know is Pentecost. And Pentecost literally just means 50th. So Shavuot came on the 50th day after Pesach. So there was Passover, and then 50 days later, there's Pentecost. Right. Now, we tend to use the words Easter, which happened at Passover, and Pentecost, which happened at Shavuot. 50 days, Easter to Pentecost. Happy Pentecost, by the way. Now, Pentecost, or Shavuot, has some unique liturgical fanfare. If you look around, our Jewish cousins, they celebrate with an indulgence in dairy foods and products, especially cheese. There's a whole tradition around that. We Christians have tended toward birthday cakes and balloons, and everyone wears red. And there's a lot of reasons for all of that. So before we dive into today's New Testament story, which is so strange with scenery and sounds, it's mysterious and captivating and unusual. But before we go into that story, I'd like to get a little better acquainted with the deeper context of Shavuot. Shavuot was what was happening. It's what everybody was going to, was the Jewish Shavuot festival. So I have some questions like, what's in the atmosphere when everyone traveled to Jerusalem? What's in their collective minds? What were they up to physically as they were all gathering together in this one place? What are the ingredients that make up this strange entry of the Spirit of God swirling in ways that are really interesting to hear and to communicate? What was going on in that moment in which God chose to enter in this dynamic new kind of way? It was such a dynamic thing that we tend to conceive of that moment as the birth of the church, the birthday of the church. That's why we have birthday cakes a lot of times. Or other times we might think of it as like, this is the moment that the church exploded and proliferated into the world, no longer knowing any boundaries. God's moving in this way. What was making that moment up? So, Jewish Shavuot is the annual celebration of the first fruits of the wheat harvest, and also a celebration of God's giving of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, especially the Ten Commandments, that was given to Israel at Mount Sinai. You probably already know. Now, 50 days earlier, when Israel gathered at Jerusalem for Passover, or Pesach, they celebrated a couple of different things. They celebrated the first fruits of the barley harvest. And also they celebrated the Exodus, that moment where God liberated Israel from slavery in Egypt. That was the Passover celebration, where God had given them basic sustenance and had set them free from their shackles so that they might be, born anew. And interestingly, Jesus used that weekend, we'll say, where the crucifixion and resurrection also liberated humanity once and for all. This is Shavuot, 50 days later, and it seems to me almost like a natural evolution of the celebration of what God has been doing. 50 days prior, Israel had just celebrated the basic sustenance of survival, liberation from slavery, and barley. But now they're celebrating something even more delicious: wheat and word. You see, the giving of the word, Israel understood that as like the birth of the people of Israel. When God gave Israel the commandments, he gave them a code, if you will, by which to live so they wouldn't self-destruct. Hey, don't lie to each other. Life will be better, right? Don't cheat on each other. I promise life will be better. Don't lust after your neighbor's stuff. So when Israel came together at Shavuot, they were celebrating some specific things. They were celebrating wheat. How many of you prefer wheat bread to barley bread? Wheat is so much more delicious. Yeah? Israel came to celebrate that God had given them such delight, not just mere sustenance of barley and escape from slavery, but now wheat from which you could make cakes, maybe. And not just liberation from slavery, but a law or a rule by which we could live and thrive together as a community. When Israel came together for Shavuot in Jerusalem, they came with these very specific things in mind. So when you envision this large collection of people coming together, I think I've got a picture, next slide maybe, when you can imagine everybody coming together, every tribe and tongue and kind of the mixture of worldviews, when they all came together in Israel, they had specific things in mind and they had specific practices. They were celebrating that God gave them wheat, and they were celebrating that God gave them a rule to live by, because if they didn't have wheat, life would be lots less delicious. And if they didn't have the Torah, life would literally unravel under the burden of cheating and lying and stealing and lusting after your neighbor's stuff and spouse. So they celebrated that God had given them such goodness that they would live by. When they came together, they all had this kind of shared consciousness at Shavuot. Now, I was trying to think of a modern day parallel, and the closest I could get is, how many of you have ever been to like a professional athletic event of some sort? Like a baseball game or football game, soccer game? I went to the DC United game one time. They were still playing at RFK Stadium. And as we were making our way in, there were like throngs of people coming in. And the spirit of those throngs of people, they were all clad in their jerseys. You know, they were all happy and festive that they belonged to this group of people who were celebrating the previous victories or wins that their team had enjoyed. But they also had this other thing, and it was this anticipation and hope that there was going to be more. That seems really close to what Israel would have had in mind as they came together. They were celebrating being a part of God's people. They were thankful for what God had given them, and they were so hopeful that God was going to give them once more, something that they could thrive and celebrate. Israel traveled to Jerusalem to celebrate being a part of God's family. Or, as the Gen Z version might say, the tribe trekked to J-Town to rave as God's fam. I learned last week. Gen Z. Let's open our Bibles to the book of Acts, chapter 2. I promise that's the only Gen Z quote, that's the only one. Yeah. Acts chapter 2 in the Bible near you. You'll want to open and follow along. I'm just going to read this whole story this morning, and you can follow along. If it's helpful to you, Acts chapter 2 is on page 885 in this Bible. Acts was written by Luke. It's his second book. It's the history after the resurrection of what happened with God or the Spirit and the church. And this is chapter 2, which marks a new kind of beginning. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now, there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at this sound, the crowd gathered and was bewildered because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and the residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. In our own languages, we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power." All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others sneered and said, "They are filled with new wine." You can just imagine them rolling their eyes. They're filled with new wine. But Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them. "Men of Judea and all who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and listen to what I say. Indeed, these are not drunk, as you suppose, for it's only 9 o'clock in the morning. No, this is what was spoken through the prophet Joel. In the last days it will be, God declares, that I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh. And your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even upon my slaves, both men and women, in those days I will pour out my Spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will show portents in the heaven above, and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and smoky mist. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the Lord's great and glorious day. Then everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." Word of the Lord. Any questions? I visited Betty Shiflett in the hospital recently, about 10 days ago. And it was an unusually late night before I could get there. And if you've been to the hospital at night, you know it's quieter then. So I passed through the emergency department, which you have to do that time of day, and I noticed first this small family that I interpreted to be Polynesian, because they look like my friend's mom, who's Polynesian. And this little family was gathered around their Oma, grandma, in a wheelchair. And I just noticed them when I walked in for whatever reason. And beyond that little family, there were all these other families, all ages and every tribe and tongue represented, all with different maladies, all presumably waiting to see a doctor of some sort. In addition to those people, there were also people in masks and badges who were directing people like me who didn't know where to go to get to the place that I was trying to go. Have you ever noticed what an odd collection of people tend to be at hospitals? UVA maybe especially. So Betty and I visited for about an hour that night. Now, if you don't know, Betty's husband Jimmy died just 7 weeks ago on Easter Sunday. And he had a bunch of health challenges that all kind of conspired. Now, Betty and Jimmy had been married more than 50 years. In addition, Betty herself was diagnosed with stomach cancer just about 2 years ago and has been navigating chemotherapy since then. And just 2 weeks ago, the doctors discovered a new intestinal constriction inside Betty's abdomen, which threatens to block her digestive tract entirely. Thus, my visit to the hospital. Well, I'd gone in prepared to kind of hold the weight of all of that with Betty, to join her in this compilation of challenges. And I even planned to kind of extend the pastoral permission to grieve or to reminisce or to recount the law. I mean, Jimmy and cancer and now this, it just seems like that was what I was facing. But when I entered the room, Betty glowed with the radiance of a saint. Our whole visit was nothing but smiles and delight. And we ended up recounting not a list of difficulties, but Betty just seemed only to be able to recount all of the things that have made and continue to make her life wondrous and beautiful. It wasn't just one or two, it was about half a dozen things that Betty seemed eager to give inventory to, counting these things like the fact that she raised her arms and tubes hung down, this unbelievable health care that we all have. We live in a town with an unprecedented level of quality health care. And here she is, all hooked up to it, literally. And I thought, yeah, I know what you're talking about. Because 15 years ago, UVA literally saved my life also. And if I didn't live here, I don't suspect I'd be here today. Not only that, but then she went on to her beautiful farm that she's lived on for the last decades, I don't know. And I was thinking when she said that, I thought, yeah, because outside my own window at my house right now, it seems like the mountain laurel is showing off with its radiance like never before, the number of blossoms on it. And it's just like bursting with beauty if I have eyes to see it. And so we then ended up kind of ping-ponging on just how blessed we are because of the worlds and lives that we get to live in. We both talked about having these beautiful marriages to people that we treasure. And we talked about how we both have adult kids who are both good and admirable, and we're so thankful that our kids are so great together. Talked about how medical insurance has enabled Betty to have treatments without a crushing kind of burden, and how we both, over a lifetime, have had lots and lots of meaningful work. And at the conclusion of our visit, Betty and I prayed not for another miraculous healing or more relief from our grief or our grievances, but we prayed with this overflowing gratitude of how God has given us everything and more, and we just gave thanks over and over and celebrated God's provision. And I left that room floating. Now, as I departed her room down those same corridors that I entered in, it was as if reality had been altered. The people that I encountered seemed like different. The space seemed different. I experienced that little Polynesian Oma in her wheelchair on the way out, and now she was all alone. And my inclination was to just go up and hug her and tell her how beautiful her family was. And I caught myself thinking, oh, you can't do that. And when I saw the man with the badge and the masks on his face that further distorted his already difficult accent, I couldn't understand him, but he smiled at me in a way that his eyes like communicated as if we were in on some kind of a secret. Like we knew something that others didn't know, and it was such an interesting thing. And then I walked out the ER door, and there was a vehicle in the ramp of the drop-off place where there was a very frustrated, tattoo-covered man with a ball cap, cigarette in his mouth, struggling desperately to get a very heavy and heavily pierced person into his vehicle, and he couldn't do it. And I wanted to walk up and just put my arms around the guy and help get this person in there as if he were my family. It seemed like the perfectly normal thing for me to do. And I caught myself and thought, what a weird thing to think, that this man would welcome you, helping put his family. And of course, there were people who knew what they were doing who were helping. Reality got altered somehow for me. The same people that I saw going in somehow were different now. The little Polynesian Oma seemed to be like this obvious repository of the Spirit of God. It's like, of course God is right in her, and she just even had her back to me. And I just knew God was in this woman. This angry, frustrated man with country music blaring and tattoos on his arms, struggling and cursing. It just seemed like, of course, God is in this thing, and I'm going to join and help in this mix a little bit. I don't do that kind of stuff usually. Strangers. And I thought, what is it with me? How does this feel so different than when I entered? But I was different. And the world was different. And I know it's hard to explain. The people of God gathered in Jerusalem from every tongue and nation and tribe to give thanks for God's provision. And they experienced altered reality in a way that they struggled to understand. What does this mean? Betty Shiflett and I gathered in a hospital room, and we indulged in gratitude and delight and thanksgiving for all the things that God has already given us. And all of our late night fatigue and our grief and even cancer seemed to fade to the background, while perfect strangers became obviously infused with the Spirit of God. And they felt familial in a way that I can hardly understand. What does this mean? That was the question everybody asked on Pentecost Sunday, and I wonder if it's not still the right question. What does this mean? Every week in our staff meeting, we read the text together really curiously. And I ask everybody, so what are you hearing? What do you notice in this text? And we read this text, of course, this past week. And so when it comes to the Pentecost story, I asked Tom, hey, Tom, what do you notice? And Tom says, well, I notice the emphasis of the diversity of the people. I mean, such a diverse group gathered, and God now residing in all flesh. Wendy pondered whether the participants who gathered in Jerusalem that day, whether their experience was kind of a function of the fact that they had gathered. And I said, so like if they wouldn't have gathered, they may not have experienced that. She goes, yeah, that seems to be what the story is suggesting. Zach pointed out, of course, the overall weirdness of the whole story, and how it seemed to him that God's people had crossed into a new realm and there was no going back after this. I think we call that crossing the Rubicon, maybe. Yeah. And you couldn't go back to the previous thoughts or understanding. Now, all of those things that they said seemed really familiar to me in my experience at UVA, this diverse place and counting blessings, and somehow the togetherness in that room altering reality. And it seems that we had gone to a place, and it was really interesting, and like there would be no going back. That combination of things that night altered my reality. What does that mean? Well, I don't know altogether. But I know that I've now preached 18 Pentecost sermons in my life. And every time There's a new kind of question or focus that preoccupies me as I unpack this text again, this text that's living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword. As I read it again, something new seems to appear. And this year, I'm most curious about the posture of the participants at Pentecost, and how the posture of the participants either prevented or promoted them experiencing God's presence with them. And I would ask us, what is our posture this Pentecost? Are we open to God doing something new? I'm also wondering, what if Pentecost is just a snapshot of God's original covenant with Abraham, all the way back in Genesis 12, where God says to Abraham, hey, through you, I'm going to bless all the families of the earth. And what if this is just a snapshot of what it looks like when that starts happening? What if Pentecost is just a foretaste of God further fulfilling the idea of Emmanuel, God with us? Remember, that's what the angels proclaimed to the single mom and the Eastern Asian mystic and the stinking shepherds and the barren woman and the aged priest. Remember, that's what the angel kept saying, Emmanuel, God with us. I wonder if Pentecost is what it looks like when they start to awaken to the reality of God's presence with us. I wonder if Pentecost is just a preview of God's full coming on earth as it is in heaven, the kingdom coming, like this earthly and eternal e pluribus unum. All this diversity, one. I wonder, what if Pentecost is indeed what God has always been doing and continues to do even now in our midst, for all who have eyes to see? And what if it is our cynicism and our skepticism, or sneering, as Luke called it, that prevents us from seeing what God is doing right now, today? What if we are so steeped in our suspicion and our cynicism that we don't have eyes to see a Polynesian Oma filled with God's Spirit, not because she's good, but because she exists? Ooh. They're drunk. Shavuot, the story of God's people, was a scheduled practice of communal gratitude and hopeful anticipation. In the middle of it, God's Spirit became palpable in people in ways that altered their reality and that they even struggled to communicate. And Peter, thank God for Peter. Peter, the denier and the believer and the constant grappler, thank God for Peter, who does his best to describe what he thinks is happening that day. And he says, oh, this is what God promised God would do for humanity a long time ago. And God's love apparently is bigger and more intimate and more inclusive than we ever dreamed. Happy Pentecost. I pray that you and I might take a deep breath of the Spirit today in the deepest places in us, and that we may be made alive anew.